conglomerates, and they coexist. I think there is a symmetric also, I would like to note that like a lot of the points we got about diversity of thought also apply to media conglomerates at the point at which even if you own two different media companies, you're likely targeting different demographics anyway. So there's an inherent incentive to pursue diversity of thought. I think most of these harms then have to be symmetric because monopolies exist on both sides. They are simply just different types of monopolies. Okay. Why are our monopolies better than their monopolies? Okay, I think largely we've based our debate in like this idea of local news being like kind of in trouble in the counterfactual. Why is local news in trouble? It's not just because local news is seasonal, though this is true to a certain extent, because sometimes when national issues like large elections take over the news, these local news stations suffer because their coverage is always going to be inferior. I think this is partially true. And then also it's harder for local news to insulate from like short-term losses. So if they dip under for like a season of news, they kind of have a tendency to just go bankrupt. And because they don't have much reserves, they're forced to shut down. If this happens over a prolonged period of time, what you end up with is a lot less local news and a lot more larger news corporations. I think they also just generally have a lower profit margin and like a lot less reserves. I think what this means is when they have to compete with larger news corporations that have more capital, they're likely to fail. I think opening government disagree with this largely, but in our conception of the counterfactual, these local news stations are acquired by larger corporations. So they're still able to exist and they're still able to function with some level of independence, but in the counterfactual, they all just fail and we just get a few like big media corporations. Why are they likely to acquire these smaller corporations? Because there's an incentive to diversify their investments. There's also an incentive to capitalize on the unique selling points of local news. And they also just want to gain a larger market share of like news media in general, because it helps them further their monopoly. I think the kind of reaction that this is unlikely is just kind of like, it's uncomparative at the point at which there's so many examples of this existing. Like the Sinclair Broadcasting Group is one of the largest news media outlets in the entire US. I think it's larger than CNN, and it's completely comprised of local news stations that are just owned by one large corporation. Okay, why is the presence of local news stations preferable? Okay, I think firstly we have that they act as a counter voice to larger news corporations. This now directly clashes with OG's metric of diversifying thought. Why is this true? Because when you decentralize the management structure in conglomerates of independent news organizations, it means you have more disparities in decision making and you are more likely to cater to a niche market. I think that the impact of this is you're likely to diversify in point of view from large news with the like target audience of the lowest common denominator to like that are only profitable to like express beliefs that are most widely popular, whereas we get more diversity of thought because there is an existence of a counter voice. We also pressure these larger news corporations then to express more diverse opinions to avoid their audience being poached by these smaller groups. Why is this good overall? I think we lessen the influence of money over which views are expressed at the point at which we have more independence in the way smaller news operates in reference to larger news corporations, because there's just more decentralization. I think we then allow more impartial reporting. Voters are better informed and less primed to be biased, and there's better access to your preferences when you go to the polls. Okay, why else is this really important? So the second metric here, I think, is representing previously neglected communities and previously neglected points of view. I think more decentralized and more localized news is more likely to represent key interests and stories pertinent to smaller communities. This looks like nobody really caring about the ecological disaster of pollution in like Dingle Bay in the west of Ireland, except the residents there who kind of rely on its fishing industry heavily in their local economy. No one ever reports about it because nobody else in the country cares about it, and it's an area with a low population. I think if they had their own local news media, they would probably talk about it a lot. What we get here is access to increased information about locally pertinent issues. I think there's three main impacts of this. Firstly, news is simply better reflects the concerns of ignored communities and allows them to derive more practical informational value from viewing it. But before I move on, I'll take a POI from closing.
Fox and local news are talking about different things. Why are they competing with each other?
They're talking about different things. They compete because small, they still have to report on national issues together. I think the mechanism by which local news are able to exist in this point is when you have a conglomerate, you're able to collaborate with all these small local news stations when they have to report on the bigger issues like an election. So instead of having less capital to report on like entirely relevant news to everyone, they're able to collaborate and like spend a lot less money on the capital and the overhead of reporting on these kinds of issues. I think in our counterfactual, they're better enabled to compete, and there is like an incentive for companies to acquire them. Okay, the second impact of this to small communities, it allows local news to spotlight on platforms issues of neglected communities. Why is this important? Because largely the media landscape now largely relies on virality. So formal reporting at a local level on important issues ignored by like the chattering media classes can snowball into wider attention through like social media and things like this. This looks like local reporting on the water crisis in Flint, Michigan, forcing larger news outlets to platform the plight of an ignored community of like the like people who have been neglected by their local government. Like CNN had to report on it because it went viral on social media and a lot of people were talking about it. This looks like more material support for these issues, empowering oppressed, unheard, and unplatformed minorities that have been starved of a platform. It lends more support and widens their platform, because if the reporting exists, it is capable of going viral, and if the reporting doesn't exist, it can't go viral. Lastly, we enable greater political participation. I think especially in regions otherwise served by large monopolistic media corporations, political issues addressed by larger companies are often irrelevant to these communities. When all of the issues you view on the news are irrelevant, why should you bother voting? I think we report on more local political issues. People are more likely to turn up to the polls and more likely to accurately assert their preferences. All of these reasons proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the previous speaker for a very fine speech. Quick checkup, is my panel ready? Then I am very happy to call upon the member of government. Here.
Can you hear me well? Then just a few seconds. Sorry, just a second. Okay, starting 3, 2. Oh yeah, I'm really sorry I didn't set up the timer. So now starting 3, 2, 1, go. Look, on CG, we will actually explain why the news market is changing and why people in the end of the day get more coverage of more various spectrums of ideas, and this brings more informed choice, and this brings an open-mindedness for a variety of people. This gets an ability for more centrist Republicans to actually discuss their ideas for their candidates, to get a platform to pursue their agenda, rather than being washed within the Fox media, which does not actually get them the possibility to pursue and push their agenda, thus embroadening the perspective and of views of their electorate. And this is the hugely important distinction over OG, because they miss, first of all, the actual explanation what changes. They just say now they don't get the monopoly without any explanation, and like specifically like working explanation on how media operates and why this media, why new media will be like working enough and will have enough resources to actually get their part of the case, and all the impacts that they are putting are still getting only to the point that, well, some people get more news, in some way they have more informed choice. But also we will tackle the idea of the local media, starting right away from this part with the opening opposition. So they basically say that, look, that on the comparative, this local media would not get any money and any funding. We have the incentive to cover them. We believe that it's much more important for local media to be actually covered representatively towards their circuit and to represent their ideas and problems, which will incentivize local community to act or to do different stuff, rather than having just one big outlet that is abusing and covering all of that is happening there. why specifically changes on our side of the house? Because we believe that specifically because these big companies enter the market, and they are because these big conglomerates either acquire the local companies, which means that they are now might have comparatively less funding for the local news on the comparative the center part of the like a big and central news. They're fixing the abusing the agenda, giving much more national news or politically motivated news rather than coverage of local issues. But also they are less likely to be actually representative of their thoughts. Comparative is that we would have local news companies that are funded by the communities. They are funded by the donors and non-governmental organizations that are incentivized that are hiring people from on the ground rather than sending someone from the central city covering something in the region that know the stuff. What changes in the comparative? Those smaller companies, which are constantly focusing on the local problems, are now, and the big companies are forced to cooperate with local companies to sign contracts with them, to give them money for actually engaging and exchanging information, for conducting mutual researches and journalistic researches and inquiries, accessing them information and access to the events that are happening right away there. The comparative is in the and the outcome of this particular thing is more accurate news representation and coverage of local communities, and thus the more accurate messaging of the big media companies that are still existing, because they are now forced to get a more accurate and more direct cooperation with the local communities. But also we believe that on the comparative, these communities exist and their news are being heard and discussed within the community. Second of all, that's on the comparative, all loses on this part of the spectrum, because the part of their case just goes within our spectrum, because they don't provide any information why this representation is accurate. They don't explain how this, why these communities will not necessarily live on their small scale. All of this doesn't work specifically. Second of all, how the spectrum changes and why there's more diversification and how media works. So look, right now what's happening, why big companies have an ability to fuck up and monopolize market actually, rather than just big oligarch which has more money. When you have a big company, even in developed countries, like Fox News or CNN news giants, so they have multiple channels, which are some of them politically aligned, some of them not politically aligned. But all of these channels gives a huge money boost to their companies and to their assets. What does it give? It creates a huge safety net and a huge reserve fund for conducting high quality, like not the high quality, but the most attractive, not necessarily high quality in terms of representation, but high quality in terms of attraction and appealingness of this researches, of this media reports and the materials. They can boost like a new TV show. They can boost a new documentary that explains all of their ideas. They can buy other channels, and they can actually force them to cover something that they want to cover. On the comparative, they now have much less free money to actually cater all of the spectrum of the auditorium to read and watch specifically them. What does it change? It means that there is now much more access for smaller or middle media to be visible for more people. Why? Because they, like big companies, even though they have more money, they have now less access for everyone and cannot compete on all of the spectrums of news media cycle. Meaning that they now have to provide actually more representation for different viewers, or they would not be able to cover all the spectrums. What does it mean? It means that now there will not be just a Fox Media, which is like a big one conglomerate, but rather multiple different rights-leaning centrist and of different spectrum of the political spectrum, different medias that are covering different spectrums of idea, which actually appeal to different parts of the society. Why this is specifically important? As I have explained before, we believe that it brings the specific mechanism for people to actually get an access to a normal analysis and like thorough analysis of different problems for different points of views, rather than just headlines and a big analytical materials for the most popular parts of the problems that they want to discuss, and not being able to actually discuss anything else. What does it specifically bring? It changes the spectrum of political ideas. It changes the spectrum for people to get engaged with different issues, and specifically it brings the news bubble. Why? Because now I will read the media that is not that far right as Fox News, and it's forced by right because of this as investors, but rather I would like to engage with different spectrums of ideas, which means that I have more ability to change my mind, to cater my worldview, and have a better society. For all the students, back to propose.
Thank the previous speaker for a very fine speech. A kind reminder, because I've noticed it in more than one speech until now, not to single out anyone, but just to remind you that in this EUDC, you're allowed to unmute yourself in the last 15 minutes for allowed POIs, in case the people just don't see the chat sometimes. Is my panel ready? Cool, then without further ado, I'm very happy to call upon the member of opposition. Hey.
Sorry, can you hear me? Good. Okay. Panel, the extension coming out from closing opposition is simple. We will prove that this policy worsens information that is available in context beyond what OO says, because they claim that this debate only occurs in areas like local media outlets. We'll talk about why, even on a national level, media is worsened as a result of this policy. The problem with the Gov bench is that they claim that the current media, the way the current media industry works is that it's extremely biased as things like corporate interests. We don't necessarily disagree with that characterization. What they fail to prove is why the counterfactual, where small media outlets are struggling to get by, will be any better. There's no mechanism on both benches as to explain how small media outlets will survive on their world, and we will prove why the contrary is true. First, I want to point out in my first point of extension, why the response from media conglomerate in status quo, for example, your Rupert Murdochs or your Jeff Bezos that holds big companies like Washington Post, will exploit this policy. Because what they will do in response is to dedicate their resources into a single media outlet that they already own. This is problematic because they will continue to dominate media space. And note, since they already have the infrastructure, the manpower, and the audience, at best, Gov case is a wash, and except instead of doing it for multiple media companies, they're doing it on a single one. But the worst thing is this: to the extent that they can no longer buy over smaller companies, what they would tend to do is to outcompete them instead, which spells the end of the survivability of small media outlets. Because we agree that because they can engage in things like price competition or things like hiring practices like paying journalists significantly more. And note, this is possible for the reasons that opening gave you about how these companies have deep pockets. And it's for these reasons that smaller media outlets will be starved of the resources and the capacity that they need to survive. Why then is the comparative much better? A few reasons why. First, even if we agree that these large conglomerates buy over small media outlets, the reason why existing under the big umbrella is still better is because they still have some incentive within the large umbrella to have a diversity of media outlets, which means to say that even under Fox News, you're still going to get some degree of more moderate news outlets under those large conglomerates, which on a comparative is better than only Fox News existing in the media space. More importantly, we argue that this is possible because even smaller media outlets that are bought over by your large conglomerates still retain some degree of editorial control because of things like journalists that has worked there for a long time. So even if it's more covert, the kind of news pieces you're going to get is less extreme and therefore more diversified. But secondly, we disagree that all the kind of buying over, all the kind of taking over small companies is always going to be one that is negative, because we argue that there are some people, the ability for small media outlets to coalesce, for example, through things like private investors or equity firms, allows them to do things like combine together under one big company to do things like investigative journalism, to act as a counterweight to current governmental practices. CG tells us that they want things like documentaries. We agree, but the scale of things, the scale of which documentaries take place require immense resources that small media outlets will never be able to be able to do. And as a result of that, it's only in our world where we are able to get that kind of documentaries to begin with. But more importantly, we also argue that the ability of small media outlets to coalesce is particularly important because it is only then that they are able to act as a counterweight against the already large media companies such as Fox, such as CNN, for instance, because otherwise the audience that they have at best is too small. So even if we buy the best cases of of government's bench, their margin, their impact is really small because they don't necessarily get the outreach that they want. In closing government, they tell us that small media outlets are not incentivized to do things like that. We don't disagree they have the incentive to do it. We just disagree that they have ability to do it at a point of which this policy is enacted for all the reasons I've given you in this particular extension. Before I move on, I'm happy to engage with opening government.
It is completely unrealistic to only see 1 or 2 media outlets in a country because there will always be other interest groups that will fund their even unprofitable mass media to have their views represented and gain political capital.
Perhaps, but we will argue that those will be very short-lived for the reasons that we just gave you in our extension. The fact that they will be outcompeted, for instance, the fact that they will have utterly no reach as a result of them being too small in that world. Because even if you can own a single entity, the single entity you own can be extremely large and dominate media space. Secondly, therefore, we extend the debate to contexts outside places like US and UK, deviating from the debate that is already occurring so far. Because we argue that there are countries with lower press freedom that relies on the fact that they are able to consolidate into a large company in order to maintain informational freedom. The reason why this extension is critical because on a consideration of utility, the need for information is significantly higher in those areas. Why, therefore, do you need the scale of combining many outlets together in order to reach those areas? For reasons of number one, censorships in those areas are much easier to bypass as a result of consolidation. For example, if a particular piece I have on one news channel is censored, I'm able to publish it on the other news outlets that I already have. But more importantly, the consolidation of ownership also allows for entities to exist outside of these countries. Countries like Pakistan, for example, that is very ruled by a military junta, it's very difficult to criticize the current government from within those countries. But if other outside foreign players are able to consolidate media companies within these areas or from outside and spread their message into these countries, then we are much better to get a more balanced and nuanced view of that government. And that's only possible if we have the scale that is necessary to acquire only through the kind of consolidation that we get to begin with. This extension is critical. The third thing, therefore, is that we are also able to, because news media outlets over there also have to work covertly, and as a result of that, funding becomes even more critical to these news media outlets because it's much difficult. They need to purchase things like more equipment, or they need to do things more as a result of needing to do things more stealthily. The cost generally increases, and it is only possible with extra funding from, for example, foreign investors that they are able to do this. This extension is critical because in the areas with lower press freedom, we argue that information was paramount. This is why we're very, very proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the previous speaker for a very fine speech. Quick checkup, is my panel ready? Then I'm very happy to call upon the government whip.
In just a few seconds, I have some troubles with my coverage. Okay, I'm ready. Am I audible? Okay, first of all, our comparison with opening government. We have more realistic approach. They actors who will buy these outlets are not realistic. Yes, for example, they say Green will buy this outlet, so small businessmen will buy some big outlets, but we don't understand whether they have enough resources to do that. And we understand that perhaps marginal groups opening government is talking about, it's less plausible that they will have a chance to opt in. But perhaps some other groups who are not so disprivileged can do that, because look, now Republican elite has bought all media outlets which cover all conservative audience. Yes, and for example, Republicans who are libertarians are excluded from this discourse, and we understand that in status quo, for example, Brothers Koch can buy some frequency, or some other even libertarian Republicans who has no access to this Republican elite can access to this market to buy something, because and here already on we can cover more social groups. Yes, and secondly, we say that the biggest problem is not involved whether this news will be changed or not, perhaps not, and even in best case scenario of opposition, we still can win this debate, because even if big corporation, big media are not changed, we have more reliance towards media, because everybody knows that media now are not monopolized, and they can get you can get information objectively through the discourse of other groups, and a lot of different groups can affect the situation. And in this case, you can, for example, know the stuff Donald Trump is talking about, some his sexist jokes or something like this, some his unrighteous decisions, and only in this case you can vote against Donald Trump, because on our side of the house you at least will watch it, because media outlets has more reliance, because now everybody thinks that it monopolized, it's corrupted, and it belongs only to one subject, and nobody will watch it. Even if the situation is not changed, we involve more audience in this process, and it is our distinction. Yes, on the well, the main extension of closing opposition is quite similar to opening opposition, but the main point of extension, the small media outlets don't have enough resources. Yes, but it's a big presumption, because they still have a lot of alternative sources. Firstly, they still have advertisement. For example, Amazon can be even in the small city, even, and it still want to be advertised. For example, some online casino or that stuff, they still can advertise this stuff, and they still can have a lot of money. For example, a lot of even small YouTube channels have financed because they advertise people, and what secondly, the new owners, they can be a businessmen, and they can, if they buy this outlet, they are interested in it, and of course they will finance this media outlet. But thirdly, they can have donations from its subscribers, for example, because if this media outlet doesn't have its own subscribers, we don't need to have it. Yes, because it's failed in the market. But if people are interested in it, if this media outlets provides people with actual information, they will give them money also by means of donations. They will send them bitcoins and that stuff. So no problem with resources for small media on our side of the house. About local media, we really think that open opposition is out of this debate, because the situation for local media is even better. And Arya shows you the specificity of how it's going to change on our side. But first of all, let's take open opposition, what they.
Yeah, local donors don't have the consistent capital to insulate themselves from losses. We tell you uniquely because of capital to take risks, profit market incentives, and a reach to target people of certain demographics everywhere. Diversity is uniquely reflected by conglomerates. Why does your outcome that can be accomplished through moderates tweeting outweigh it?
We think that alternative sources that were applied towards closing opposition are applied towards local media. Also, perhaps some big company has its department in the small city, and they will finance this local media to have more profit and to be advertised. Yes, but specifically on opening opposition, even if they don't have enough resources, they will have at least local agenda, because look what's happening now. You are the owner of the small media, and the big corporation buys it, and it gives you so much money, and you can refuse this proposition, because they, for example, Republican Party wants to have so many media which says that Donald Trump is a good guy. Yes, and even if big corporation on your side of the house buy this local media, they will not promote local agenda, because big corporations are interested only in national ideas. And perhaps on our side of the house, even if they have some deficiency of money, they will at least talk about really local problems, for example, water supply, electricity problems, and that stuff. Secondly, we understand that even if with resources we don't have enough problems. But for example, big corporation has an incentive to finance big media, or even if they have a specialization, big corporations are incentivized to finance only media which are talking about national problems, because national elections are dependent on this agenda, on the national agenda, and they have deficiency, or because they have to, big corporations have to finance a lot of media outlets. And on our side of the house, we have only one owner, and it gives all money, and it reinvests all its profit only to local media. Yes, and we have no problems on our side of the house with local media, because it's first, it promotes really local agenda, and it's not dependent on the season. It's permanently promotes local agenda on their side of the house, because stakeholder is interested in local agenda if he or she bought this media outlets. And second, they don't have enough problems with resources, because one owner is highly incentivized to give all money to this media outlets. So we have been opening opposition in their field, on their side. Thank you. Very proud to